Good morning. I'm Sana, and you're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. Every Monday morning, I'm joined by experts from across the country who are investigating our most pressing social issues and common curiosities. Over the next hour, you'll learn about their inspirations, motivations, and of course, what they know about the world around us. So grab that cup of coffee and get ready for a fun and insightful conversation. Who are you and how do you know? Much of our identity begins with a name, the first name, a family name. We begin to shape our ideas of who we are with family and especially with our origin stories, how we came to be part of our family, how our family became a family, how we came to live in this country or in this specific community where we grew up. But, the funny thing about stories is that stories change. We learn new pieces of a story or we learn a new perspective. And sometimes that can change what we thought we knew to be true. So, how do we make sense of who we are when that happens? These questions of identity, family, and truth are at the center of Shannon Gibney's latest novel, The Girl I Am, Was, and Never Will Be, a speculative memoir of transracial adoption. Shannon Gibney is an award-winning author and university professor, and I'm excited to chat with her today. Her previous novels include See No Color, which is drawn from her life as a transracial adoptee, and Dream Country, which received 5-star reviews and earned her a second Minnesota Book Award. Her latest young adult novel, which is what we'll be talking about today, The Girl I Am, Was, and Never Will Be, blurs the lines of reality, science, and speculative fiction in this story about origins, family, race, adoption, and personal identity. Splitting herself into two women, Shannon presents two timelines, bridged together via family and a mysterious portal in this eye-opening examination of adoption. The Girl I Am, Was, and Never Will Be, a speculative memoir of transracial adoption, is available in bookstores everywhere January 10th. Good morning, Shannon. Thank you so much for joining us.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, I am so excited. Let me just go ahead and say, this book is everything I didn't know I needed in a book about adoptees. I didn't know what to expect, right? Speculative
Yes,
fiction, this
yes.
memoir. So I had no clue. And you took me on a journey, and I was right there with you. And, towards the end of the book, you have this line that says, it is something for an adoptee to be recognized.
Yeah.
And that line, it took my breath away because yes, yes, yes. And this book does that.
So I have so many questions because I always say, you know, if you're lucky, you're sort of like with this piece of art, this book, for a long time, for years, and you're really the only one with it. Or in my case, I'm lucky enough to have a really great editor, Andrew Carr, who's this is our third book together, and he always pushes me to make things better, which is great. Um, but then once your book is published, it's not yours anymore.
Yeah.
It's sort of like a child. It goes out into the world, but then it comes back to you through other people, and their experiences with the book. And it is a really beautiful experience because sometimes things will come back to you through people that you yourself didn't necessarily see, or maybe you saw it a different way. And
Mhm.
so yeah, so I really I'm curious, when you said in the beginning, like, as an adoptee, this was the book that you sort of, I think you said, wanted, everything you didn't know that you
Mhm.
wanted and needed. Can you unpack that a little bit? What does that mean?
Yeah. Um, well, as a transracial adoptee, a transnational transracial adoptee, um, not being part of a community. I know some adoptees do experience, growing up in an adoptee community. There are different resources, but I didn't have that. So it was literally just me trying to figure out, like, what does it mean to be adopted? What does it mean to be Korean? What does it mean to be Asian in a white family? Trying to figure out all these things on my own and not really having any good, positive, supportive models for what that meant. Growing up in the age pre-Google, not even being able to ask
Yes.
Google.
Yes, that's real. It's real. Yeah, things
Yeah.
changed in the digital environment and people could have, Facebook groups and all kinds of things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So just being, finally coming to accept that there are no answers, and that not even that there are no answers, but that I shouldn't even be asking the questions, right? That having that curiosity and that imagination, so tamped down that you just are afraid to even ask because there's no answer, right? And so what happens when you don't see yourself, when you feel like who you are or what you are, no one understands, and it's wrong to even kind of be that thing. So with this book, it's like, wow, like, you know, everything I didn't know I needed because, of course, throughout the book, you're weaving the adoptee experience, or
Mhm.
many of adoptee experiences. I shouldn't say because there's not one, but so
Mhm.
many of the common questions we have, the themes that we experience, and to see that in the page.
Mhm.
And also I love the different perspectives you bring in. So birth mother perspective, birth father perspective, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
And just kind of opening up a world for us to imagine, like what would it have been like in this different life, in this different timeline of
Mhm.
being with our birth families, or even, what would it have been like for me to have had a book like this,
Mhm.
10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago.
Mhm. Right, right,
How would
right.
that have changed the story of myself that I was
Mm.
telling myself as I was growing up?
Mm, that's really rich. No, thank you so much for sharing that with me.
Mhm.
We were chatting just a little bit before we started the formal interview, and I was saying, I don't necessarily have a conscious audience in mind as I'm writing, but um, I think in some ways I'm always writing towards that girl that I was at 12 who felt so alone
Yeah.
and so isolated and did not have any language to express that.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for all the other um, adoptees out there, particularly, transracial adoptees and
Mhm.
adoptees of color who, were like, how did we get here? Like we're in the middle of this island of whiteness, a lot of us, and like, but yeah, it's sort of like the way that whiteness and most sort of dominant cultural systems um operate is like, well, you're not supposed to talk about it. You're not supposed to admit that, oh wow, like everybody around me is white and like that's weird. And
Yes. Oh my goodness, Shannon. So much in there. But it's interesting how you say like we're not supposed to notice that, like, oh, we're the only not white people here, but yet people continue to point out to us that you
yeah,
are the only white person here, and we're just supposed to take it.
yeah.
You write in, you share a vignette about being at the dinner table with your biological family, and them, pointing out like, or making kind of these quote unquote jokes about you being the only Black person in the room, but
Mhm,
also saying a lot of racist stuff about other groups of color as
mhm,
well.
mhm.
And I'm like, yeah, yes, that, yes. Oh, wait,
And
we're
it's like
all having,
dinner. It's like, like together time, like bonding time, right? And it's just sort of like, I had this great review from Kirkus, and it's like this reviewer was like, yeah, that in each timeline she can't quite, whether she's Shannon or Aaron, which was my name at birth, she can't quite get away from these racist microaggressions at the family dinner table, right? And like I just feel like, and yes, right? Like whether or not you're raised by your white, your loving white middle class adoptive family, or you're raised by your struggling in many ways uh, um, white birth mom, and their working class white family. um, like you're gonna have to deal with the racism. Like and I was talking to Haley Lash on Adoptees On 2 days ago, and and she was saying, well, I just think the book also sort of breaks down this idea that somehow, it maybe would be less racist if like people who are mixed like me might have a less racially isolating / racist experience if we had not been adopted out into these white families. And she's like, in the book totally shows that that's not necessarily the case. And what I said to her was, since for quite a long time, I would say since my teens, I mean, there's a reason why a lot of my friends, a lot of my platonic girlfriends are mixed race women, because we have, and not adoptees, because we have a lot of the same experiences in our families and communities in terms of these issues around race. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, also this idea of isolation and being isolated is such, the transracial adoptee experience and transnational transracial adoptee experience as well. And it's kind of funny because I've said before, like we experience this isolation, right? Where we're racially isolated, and have gotten some pushback actually when I was working on my dissertation research, had gotten some pushback about the idea of isolation. Cause I'm like, yeah, we are in our families and we have friends and we're involved in, whatever interests we have, but there is a piece of our experience that is completely isolated while also maintaining all these, social activities and all these friendships and communities. But again, we have this experience that, no one else is having, or at least that we are not connected to those other people who are having it.
Right. And that's where I think a lot of the shame comes in, where it's like that, again, and we can't articulate that, as we go through, sort of like the normal adolescent development, and then, into being adults, right? And having many of us, not all, everybody has different experiences, but having these connections. I know I did with Black communities finally, as an adult, and having that be very healthy and nurturing, but always at some point feeling like an imposter, right? Like, okay, they're going to find out, right? Which is only compounded by the fact that I'm half white too, right? But it's like, oh, they're going to find out that like I'm not really Black, right? Like I can't perform Blackness, like, I'm learning Black English, but like it's, yeah. So I mean, I just think, and then a lot of my friends who are Korean adoptees, it's like, oh well, I don't speak Korean, I wasn't raised on Korean food, I didn't go to Korean church, I didn't, and it's just very much like, well, you're not really Korean American then, like you're not really Asian American, right? And yeah, and that experience, and I think I use this phrase in the book, growing up in the heart of empire, right? I mean, there's a lot of, right? There's a lot of work on by BIPOC folks on how we know white people better than they know themselves. While, people who are transracial adoptees and multiracial folks, right? Like, I mean, we know intimately, like not just kind of, okay, the white people at work or whatever, right? But like within the family, right? Like all of the hypocrisy and the idiosyncrasies and the unresolved racial stuff that's just in every family, right? And some of that, of course, gets played out on our bodies. And yeah, so it's a lot. There's a lot of stuff there. Yeah.
Yes. And thank you for bringing that up. We are in the heart of empire, which yes, and that is our experience. And I'm so glad that you've written this book that kind of brings that experience into the forefront and out of our own, right, out of our individual experience, out of the shame that we might feel that is not ours to feel, right? That is not ours to carry. And so I think that was also part of what I loved about the book is that, for me as an adoptee, I'm reading it, of course, through my lived experiences and all the things that you're saying, where it's like, yes, 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 right? But even for someone who is not an adoptee, like you are pulling back that curtain and inviting non-adoptees into this world that for some folks might feel like fiction in and of itself to read about these experiences, very real experiences of family, and the inclusion and exclusions that we have to navigate.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, adoptees are not the only people who have these ruptures in our identities and these ruptures in our stories, living in a culture that really values kind of like a holistic, seamless narrative for these things, right? And so, there are people who are, refugees, there are people who are immigrants, there are people, um, usually it's marked by trauma, like those ruptures are marked by trauma, right, of some sort. Um, but everybody has had some kind of experience, I think, in their life, regardless of what their, racial or other identities are, where it's like they had this one story in their mind that they thought was sort of the way things were, and then come to find like, well, no, that's not actually it at all. And all of us are in families, and all of us know how complicated families are. You can have a sibling that you might actually be very close to, and they could have a completely different experience in the
Yes.
family than you have, and neither one of you is wrong. It's just, that's just the way it is. So these are things that, yeah, definitely are brought to the forefront, and I think are sort of like foundational of the adoptee experience. The way that it's sort of structured and laid out here, but these are things that I think that, and I hope that every reader can have some kind of connection and recognition with.
Yeah, absolutely. Because family is so complicated, so complicated.
I mean, it is, and I mean, and that's the thing. It's like, it's not like other people's families aren't complicated. It's just that when you're, mixed, when you're a transracial adoptee, it's just another layer of intersectionality, right? So it's just another layer of complexity to navigate.
Yeah. And our complexity is right there for everybody to see and inquire about. So
Right.
in many ways we can't hide it the way that
Yeah.
some families are hiding all of these family secrets that pop up in how you're experiencing family and experiencing love and identity and how you think about yourself. But like any good secret, it typically something comes out and you have
Yes.
that rupture, that unraveling of what you thought was true, and then you have to piece it back together in
Yes.
some sort of way.
Yes. No, totally. Totally. Yeah. And I mean, yeah, that's the thing, is sort of like our difference is we're hyper visible, so and then people feel like it's okay to come up to you and be like, well, how was that your mom? And,
Yeah.
where are you from? And like all this stuff. Right. And, and then as adults, many of us get salty and are just like, oh yeah, how's your divorce? Or like whatever, something that is just like, why would you feel it's appropriate? I don't know you. Right. Like, I don't, let's be clear, right? That is not appropriate. Like, I'm done, you know?
Yes.
And so, yeah, I mean, I got to a point, I'm 47 now, but I got to a point in my 20s where that would be my response, because I'm just like, just, and I'd like to say, yes, it was a lot of white people, but there were Black people who would do that too,
Oh
for
yeah,
sure,
yeah.
and especially being mixed, having people come up, what are you? Oh,
Oh
I'm a
yeah.
human, like, what is going on? Right. Yeah.
Yeah, we do. One superpower we have is we have way more practice at navigating some of these
Oh,
questions and kind of piecing the stories together, telling a narrative that we want to tell or responding in a way that we want to respond. And so I love that because yes, we're hyper visible, but that doesn't give you the right to roll up on us and
like, do you have no home training whatsoever? Like, you're showing yourself. Like, back up and sit down. So, but people feel entitled, for some, especially around racial stuff, that it's like a psychological come apart. It's like, to me, and I don't want to like objectify trans folks or think that, um, these experiences are somehow equal, because they're not. But to me, it's sort of like, when somebody comes into the bathroom that doesn't look, the woman's bathroom, and like
Right.
they don't look like a female bodied person, and people are like,
Yeah.
it's like that, and it's just sort of like, uh, but they feel empowered
Mhm.
to have that response, which even sometimes can be like a violent response, right?
Yeah.
To
Yeah.
police these borders, kind of thing.
Hmm.
So I think the experience of being a transracial adoptee made me like hypersensitive to those kind of reactions that I have in myself around
Hmm.
other things,
Yeah.
and I always say too that I do think it's made me a better parent too. I have an 8-year-old and a 12-year-old, and just to understand, like, the power dynamics
Hmm.
within families, which is something that people don't like to talk about or admit, right? That it's like, because parenting is so hard and it's so exhausting and it's all the things, but it's like you still have an enormous amount of power over
Hmm.
your children, over like the narrative of your family, and like their experiences within it, racially and otherwise, and so to just kind of really try to constantly check myself, like,
Yeah.
okay, this is my experience. That's not necessarily my son's experience that he's having right now, and that's not necessarily my daughter's experience. And guess what? That gets to be okay. Like,
Yeah.
that doesn't have to negate my identity. However I think of myself as mom, as black mom, as like whatever, like, they get to have that. And there's going to be things that like I just don't understand about being, their dad's Liberian, about being, uh, black kids,
Hmm.
African immigrant and African American, like, you know, we live in Minneapolis, like growing up in an urban district in, the 2020s. Like, I mean, it's just they're having a different experience. And like that needs to be okay, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. Well, let's take a quick break. You're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm Sana, and we're here on WYXR 91.7 FM. This is Let's Grab Coffee, and I'm chatting today with Shannon Gibney, the author of The Girl I Am, Was, and Never Will Be, a speculative memoir of transracial adoption. Now, Shannon, one thing that you do in this book is you have these parallel timelines and multiple timelines that are happening, and a lot of it is centered around Aaron and Shannon,
Mm-hmm.
right? So, can you tell us just a little bit about that choice
Yeah.
to kind of intersperse Aaron and Shannon into these stories in this way?
Yeah. So I was born in 1975 to Irish American, a woman and an African American father. And then I did my birth search when I was 19. And at that time, I found out that my birth father had died from complications from a high speed police chase in Palo Alto, California. But I did find out that my birth mother was still living at that time. And she uh, had put her name on something called the Central Registry, which, when you were of age, an adult in the eyes of the state, you could put your name on that, and adoptees and birth parents can find each other through that if there's a match,
Mm.
and they find that, they facilitate that through your adoption agency. And so, um, you know, I I found I found her when I was 19, and I also found out at that time that my name at birth was Erin Rebecca Powers.
Mm.
Um, and so, you know, that was revelatory. It's like
Yeah.
you don't know what to do with that information. Um, and, you know, I have thought about Erin Powers in different ways throughout the years.
Mm.
Who who is that girl slash young woman? What would be her relationship with her mother?
Mhm.
Um, And I had a very complicated, difficult relationship with Patricia Powers, my birth mother, for a lot of different reasons.
Mhm.
Um, and Erin's relationship in the book is really difficult with her as well.
Mhm.
Um, and so I really wanted to, in this book, like explore deeply, like go in deeply to the experience of um, an alternate life, you know, based on choices that like you had no control over, really.
Yeah.
Which again, adoptees are not the only people who have this experience, but um, there's actually a lot of adoptees who are just sort of like, they might not talk about it, but
Mhm.
it's just sort of like, yeah, like what would it have been like, to grow up with my mother in Korea, or etc. And and my thought was, and this definitely proved true as I had the experience of writing the book, that there's certain knowledge, there's certain truth, there's certain information that is really valuable,
Mhm.
that you can get from sitting deeply with those questions and with those sorts of alternate timelines, even if they're not necessarily quote unquote true, right? Like, which is like the holy grail. Like, truth is like sort of like the holy grail of, like, American realist,
Mhm.
fiction and nonfiction and whatever, right? But it's just sort of like, yeah, but that, there's certain questions and certain issues that, like, are deeply important, that
Mhm.
you can't really investigate if your most important fidelity is to the truth. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I love this idea of, what is true, that there can be multiple truths. Something that you kind of touch on in the book is just the idea that we'll never know the truth if there even is
Yeah.
a truth
Right.
to be known.
Right.
We will never know it, and that is also something that, as an adoptee, I've also come to understand and accept, because even if you are in reunion, that you will never know the truth, right? Capital T,
Right.
of, what happened, why relinquishment, the hopes and dreams, all these things. You will only know what that person is telling you today, as they're rewriting a narrative for themselves as well. So
Yeah. Yeah.
being in that discomfort of, there is no one story, there is no one truth. And I love the way that you created for us to enter into this world of these multiple truths, these multiple realities. And also, I thought it was so refreshing, I guess, to see a reunion story that is as complicated and messy as we are as human beings.
Yeah. Yeah. My dear friend, Sun Young Shin, who is a Korean adoptee and a wonderful poet. I mean, that was one of her comments when she finished the book, was that, so many reunion stories end with the first reunion, right? And
Mhm.
she's like, I think it's actually important that, you're older, that, you're 47, and, like, you met her when you were 19, and so it's like all these years, that you're sort of reflecting and refracting, and, you know, things are changing in your own life, right? And,
Mhm.
I first met her when I was a college student, and then, graduated, and, went to grad school, worked, and, then I got married and had kids, um, and, you know, that's a lot of life, right? And that's not even
Yeah.
her life, right? That she's, um, and then I always say to people, to get to a place as a parent where it's very clear to you that the best choice for everyone involved is is to terminate your parental rights, is to give up your child and have
Mhm.
somebody else you don't know raise them. That's intense. I
Yeah.
mean, there's like a lot of stuff that that there's so many steps for you to get there, right? There's so many things that you're navigating in terms of oppression. And so, you know, those things don't go away 20 years later, when and if, you're in reunion. If anything, the knot is just tighter, and so it's not like, oh, like, oh, tiptoeing through the tulips. Hi, but it's like, no, like my birth mom is still like, she is this, white lesbian person whose family was not okay initially with that identity, and from this working class environment, and this family that has like a lot of weird racist ideas that like have not been unpacked, right, that then she's taken on, right, and it's like, and then she has all this guilt and emotion and all kinds of, like, I mean, honestly, I'm not a birth mom or birth parent, so I can't imagine giving up, a child. I did lose a baby in a stillbirth, and that was completely devastating. But that's different, than knowing that, like, okay, this person is out in the world and I have given them up. And like, I mean, psychologically, I don't, that's super intense, right? And so she's dealing with all of that. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that, as I was putting this book together, that wasn't at the forefront of my mind. Like, okay, I want to make sure that I tell this story, of reunion, like longitudinally, but now that it's done, that is something that is coming back to me sort of in waves as people are reading it, like, wow, okay, that there really aren't that many stories out there that really show like the deep complexity of reunion. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it's just so important because otherwise we get these very limited portrayals that make it sound like, oh, yay. And then you find your birth family. And like you said, you're holding hands and singing songs, skipping through through a field of fresh flowers. And
And
it's
it's just
like,
not. It's
no.
no, yeah. And as you say, people are people, right? It's really messy and complicated, and all the things. And even if you have, like, your the best intentions, and you sort of, you know, there's gonna be a lot. There's gonna be a lot of, yeah.
Yeah. But I think you do it so wonderfully in bringing in this idea of who your birth mother, may have been at different points in her life, and how she may have been thinking through, relinquishing her child. So I found a lot of compassion and complexity, and also, this is a complicated woman, right? We're many things. We're not good or bad. We're just many different things. And so I love just kind of imagining, what would it have been like for a birth mother or birth father? How are they wrestling through these things? And, many tears were shed while reading this book.
Tell me about the tears, Suna. Tell me about the tears.
Well, I'm also thinking about, in one section of the book, you're reflecting on the birthday, right? And imagining like birth mother on this day, like you have a child, you kind of remember that day, like
Oh, oh yeah,
that's in your
yeah,
mind.
yes, yes.
And so just imagining like what is that like for a person who, relinquishes their child, or forced to give up their child, and reflecting on, that remembrance. And I think as an adoptee who is not in reunion, it just made me think like, yeah, there is someone out there who is remembering me
Mm-hmm,
on my
mm-hmm,
birthday, whether it's the birthday that I know is my birthday, or the day they know that
mm-hmm,
I was actually born, right? And wow, like that
mm-hmm,
connection.
mm-hmm. Right. It's felt like, even if, again, fact is not everything, right? Like, it, it, but this is something, as a human being, it affects you, and the experience imprints on your body,
Yes.
and so there's no way that, even if you're suppressing it or repressing it, I guess would be the word, like, still affecting you. You're still responding and reacting to it. Um, and and so yeah, just because we can't point at something and locate, like, you know, that's it, that's my birth mom, or that's the day that I was born, or it doesn't make it any less real or any less important. I mean, I do feel like that's one of the implicit arguments that the book is making.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that you brought up this idea of we still hold it in our bodies, right?
Yeah,
Just like our birth parents are still holding a lot of memories in the body. We're still holding a lot in our body that maybe we can't even access, but that has deeply impacted how we are making new connections, how we are feeling safe and secure or not.
yeah,
And there's a lot of those themes in the book. And I was like, yes, this is, ah.
yeah. The sort of, you know, intergenerational nature of adoption, I think, is is also a huge part of the book,
Yeah.
and how that gets passed down, even through the holes, right? The lack of information that we may have, either biologically, right? Because part of the story too is, my birth mom, when I met her, was like, you need to do regular breast exams because there's this history of breast cancer in our family. And and being young, I was like, okay, yeah, whatever, and then um in 2019 I was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I had been diligent about getting regular mammograms because of her, because she warned me,
Mhm.
and and yeah, in my adoptive family too, it's just like regular checkups, all these things. But it's like a lot of people don't know how limited the health history that most adoptees have,
Mhm.
and how that can really have a detrimental impact on our lives and well-being and health. Um, and so, but that too is a form of lineage, right? Like
Yeah.
even breast cancer, right? Even something that's trying to kill you is something that is passed down, and is therefore, a connection,
Mhm.
to be noted. Um, Even, I sort of argue, like, in some weird way, cherished as an adoptee, because it does connect me to all these women, in my maternal line on that
Mhm.
side.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take another break. This is Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. You're listening to Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm Sana, and I'm here with Shannon Gibney, the author of The Girl I Am, Was, and Never Will Be, a speculative memoir of transracial adoption. Now, before the break, you were talking about what we have, these connections we have to people we don't know, and we may never know. And what struck me too was in the book you talk about your birth father and
Yes.
some of his interest and his intellect and curiosity, and thinking about some of these interests we have that seem to come from nowhere, that aren't shared in our adoptive families. And that also sticks out to me as we're thinking about, where does this interest come from, or this personality? Where does this
Mhm.
come from?
Mhm.
And it is like these pieces to, the life we could have had, or the people who we could have known.
Mhm. Yeah, no, and um, birth fathers, there are these little micro essays on the absurdities of the adoptee experience in the book too,
Mhm.
um, and one of them is sort of like the typical um, popular adoption story, right? And the birth father is rarely, if ever, mentioned in that. And for a lot of mixed Black people of a certain generation, born in, I think, probably late 60s, 70s, early 80s, the sort of racial configuration of our parents was like white woman, Black man. And so Blackness is sort of tied to the paternal line in that way. And yeah, like, it I didn't have very much information to go on with my birth father, particularly because he died when I was 6.
Hmm.
Um, and so, but his family was based in Detroit, which was about 45 minutes from where I grew up. And so I was able to connect with them. And, I'm still in contact with my aunt, Annette, who's very welcoming and helpful to me, shared a lot of information. Um, but yeah, just sort of extrapolating the little bits of information that I have about my birth father. Um, and I never got to meet him
Hmm.
in real life, but through this book, through art, um, I get to.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
And I love that because again, as you mentioned, the birth father like does not exist in in
No,
like
no,
just
completely.
completely erased. And so I love the way that you incorporate him in this story, in a way that is very integral to this idea of like who I could have been, and even who I am, right? And so I love that you bring in, this picture of a man, right, who very important in your life. And so I really appreciated that.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah. And um, I mean, one of the things, Boise Collins Jr., Boise Christopher Collins, sorry. So Boise is the name of my birth father, and it's also the name of my grandfather. And then I have an uncle also named Boise, and then I named my son Boise. He's the fourth in the line. Um, so sometimes it can get a little confusing. But Boise Christopher Collins, my uncle, when he read an early draft of the book, I mean, what he said was he was like, you know, I asked him like, what are you really taking from this? And he said, I think the biggest thing is the journey, this journey that you're on. But he was like, but also it's also um, this kind of ode to your father
Mhm.
in this, like you're honoring your father in this way.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And I love the name, right? The naming practices, and even thinking about Boise Christopher Collins, like the naming practices, with him, and then thinking about your son as well.
yeah.
And, of course, this idea of name and legacy and identity is interwoven throughout the book. But just thinking about, your son, and continuing that legacy and bringing forth, that part of your family from the past, but also that you're creating. So powerful.
Yeah, no, and yeah, that part also always moving for me, like the intentional parts that we can, there's these parts of our stories that precede us that we don't really have any control over, but we're also here.
Yeah.
um and so we do have control over certain parts of our stories. And and I know it's very complicated, and my son is young, he's almost 13, and so he doesn't, you know, he understands some of it, but a lot of it is abstract. And so, um, but I wanted a name that would ground him, and I know that it does
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. It's so beautiful. Um, the ability to rewrite the narrative,
Yes.
but also to decide, what is grounding us, right? What are we tethered to, and to making that what we want it to be, which is also a lot of what I got from the book, right? We get to decide if we're going to walk through that portal. We get to decide, if we're going to create a different timeline for ourselves. We don't have to be beholden to a past, and we also don't have to be beholden to, the adoption narratives
Mhm.
that we learn and that are trying to be forced upon us. We get to decide. I love that. I was really taken, I think, by the naming practices. So thinking about your son and even, just the family on your father's side, but also obviously Aaron and Shannon and, this idea of a whole nother person, right? That was marked by this name. Um, and now who could they be? And of course, it made me think about a lot of adoptees who reclaim a birth name or just create a different name, right? As a part of saying, this is who I am, this is my story. And it made me think a lot about my own name. So I reclaimed my Korean birth name, which, who named me, who knows, right? Some people reclaim because, they feel this connection to a birth family or birth mother, right? Of course. And other people we know, like it's, some social worker who put down a name.
Right. I mean, that's the thing. It's just, you don't, a lot of people don't know, particularly, my friends who are international, transnational adoptees, you just don't, there's the texting exchange at the end of the book, right? Like between, Sun Young and Kim McKee and Sarah Park Dallin. And it's just this sort of like highlighting the fact of like sort of the orphan manufacturing process, right? Like how did that happen at a lot of these sites like Korea and the fact that, again, you don't know. You don't, is this my name? Is this my identity? Because so much of that stuff was fabricated.
Yeah. So I love the idea of like reclaiming it, right? And even, thinking about that in that text exchange that you include in the book, thinking about what gets lost in translation as well.
Yes.
So if it's, transnational adoption, what gets lost in the romanization of names, what gets lost even in the transcription of a quote unquote origin story or family history. And so I think about that a lot because like the romanization of my name, and the way that a Korean person would say it are completely different. And so even for me, like different communities that I'm a part of pronounce my name differently, but I like it because it is also a marking of if you know me through the adoptee community or through Asian American or Korean American community, you're going to say my name one way. And if you don't know me through that way, you're going to pronounce it in a different way. And I'm okay with that.
Well, it expresses, again, it's sort of this refraction of your identity coming back to you, right? It expresses who you are in these different spaces,
Yeah.
which again is a form of recognition that, again, for adoptees is really, really important because most of us didn't have that growing up.
Yes, and this book is such a book of recognition. Like I said, I cried at the end when you have that line about, to be recognized, because as humans, that's what we want. We want to be seen. We want to be recognized as we are, as we wish to be seen. And for adoptees, we're navigating that throughout our lives and, with different people in a lot of different ways. Now, one thing about the book, obviously a lot about rewriting the narrative, questioning the narratives that we have. And as we started our conversation today, you said the book, it's done, it's out there in the world, and then it kind of has its own life, right? There's what you wrote, and then there's how people receive it. And so I'm also wondering for you, now that the book is out and this is the story as it is written, how do you feel about this story? Because I know that, the writing might be done, but the story is never done.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So this is my third, I call it, a novel memoir. I don't know what it is, right? So it's my third novel. I also write, I've started writing children's picture books. I've got 2 anthologies, and so I write across many genres and communities and whatnot. Lucky enough to be able to do that, but I think a lot of writers would say this about at least one of their books, but I mean, I never thought I would write this book because I remember being like this particular book, because I remember being 19 and in the middle of Search and Reunion and talking to people, and they're like, oh, that's an amazing story. You're a writer. You should totally write that down. And my response was like, I am never writing this down for people to just consume as like, a back to school special or, some ridiculous, like, telenovela or, whatever. Like, this is my life. Like,
Yeah.
it's not entertainment. It's not like, you know, something to, oh, that's so interesting. Like, let me learn. Like, there was just something always repulsive about that
Mhm.
to me. I never wanted to do that. And so, in telling the story, and sort of like the multiple iterations, because yes, I do have letters from my birth mom, so stuff is in her voice, right? And there's, my birth father, which, I created based on the information that I have, and um, my imagination, and um, yeah. So I mean, I I um I wanted to write something about the adoptee experience that didn't objectify us,
Mhm.
that asked deeper questions about our positionality,
Mhm.
in the larger culture, in our families. Um, how do you make meaning and a kind of coherent identity when you don't have the information that everyone else in the culture does to do that? Right?
Yeah.
Like, those were more of the questions that I really wanted to, and sort of like, you know, in a culture that clearly has not dealt with our racial past, much less our racial present.
Mhm.
What happens when you have these families where children are, um, some of the only, or maybe the only, um, like, racialized subjects, meaning, folks of color in the family. Like,
Mhm.
what is the effect of that?
Yeah. Yeah. Look, I cannot say, I can't say enough good things about this book. Um, Absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for writing this book. And also, I just love the way, even in reading it, I'm like, "Wait a minute. Is this true? Is this true?" Right? True in quote, like, "Is this true? Wait a minute. What timeline and what reality am I in?" Which I think is part of the point, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so I just love it, and it's so beautifully done. I love, like you said, incorporating, your birth mother's voice, incorporating your father, incorporating documents from the adoption agency, and also the little micro essays about adoption. So I mean, everything is here. I love the book. Uh,
Good.
love it. Shannon, thank you so much for being with us this morning. I cannot, again, love the book. Can't wait to read it again.
Thank you. And thank you for, I always say, something so magical happens when adoptees are in a room together, even if it's a Zoom room,
Yeah.
and really talking about the stuff,
Mhm.
the real stuff. And it is very emotional for me. So I really appreciate, all your insights and thoughtfulness, that you brought to our conversation today, and thank you for sharing it also with a wide audience, because as we know, when you are, from historically marginalized communities and you're trying to create books and art and whatnot, it can be very hard, to get the word out about it. So thank you so much for
Yes,
helping.
thank you. Thank you again to Shannon Gibney, the author of The Girl I Am, Was, and Never Will Be, a speculative memoir of transracial adoption. Of course, you could tell, absolutely love the book, and I think you will love it as well. It's available in bookstores January 10th. For today's positive note, I actually want to leave you with a passage from the book, which says, "Embrace that there are no singular truths. There is no one reality. There are no stories without holes. There are only spaces to be breathed into, sometimes rewritten." I love this acknowledgement of there are no singular truths. And I think for those of us who maybe have complicated stories of who we are or who we've been that we've been telling ourselves, this gives us hope. It gives me hope that we can always rewrite the narratives. We don't have to be beholden to or constrained within or confined within the stories we have been telling us about ourselves, particularly if those are stories filled with shame. But we have the power to rewrite our narratives and in the process, rewrite who we are. Well, this has been Let's Grab Coffee on WYXR 91.7 FM. I'm Sana. I'm here every Monday morning. I can't wait to be back here with you next week. And go ahead and share this show with a friend. You can always listen to the replays of the shows on WYXR.org, or also subscribe to Let's Grab Coffee in podcast format, available on all streaming platforms.